emergency plans for future emergencies. Thank you. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I'll now turn to our first questioner. Mr. Barrett, you have the floor for up to 6 minutes, please.
The Auditor General said, and I quote, "The Public Health Agency of Canada did not develop project objectives and goals, budgets and cost estimates, assessments of resource needs, or risk management activities." Ms. Jeffrey, did you develop a budget for ArriveCan?
There was governance established around ArriveCan, but it focused on the public health deliverables and the nature of the border measures that needed to be put in place and operationalized through the app.
Okay,
but there was no overall project budget established, as should have been the case in IT projects.
No budget. Was there a projection of the expected cost?
There were initial contracts put in place, but incrementally, as you're aware, those contracts were added to and were administered in sequence. So there was no overarching budget that covered those costs.
Do you believe this failure to have a budget is the reason that the cost of this project ballooned to at least $60 million for taxpayers?
When we look at the situation in Canada in March 2020, it was a novel pandemic, and the timelines and the nature of the response that would be required were not known. This was an evolving situation. I recall when we looked at how...
I appreciate your response, though it is not an answer, and you'll have noted in the Auditor General's report that the pandemic was not an excuse or justification for the rules to be thrown out the window. Your agency owned this app for almost the entirety of the pandemic, and you never developed a cost estimate for it. Did you do any performance reviews on it, quarterly or every 6 months, every year? Did that happen?
The operations of the app were evaluated through a governance structure that included Director General, ADM, and Deputy Management Committees on Border Services, and we assessed the operational results of the app as we went.
But the cost to Canadians was never included in a single review by your department. Is that correct?
The documentation of the cumulative cost was not a part of the documentation of that governance, correct?
Who is the minister ultimately responsible for the Public Health Agency of Canada?
The Public Health Agency of Canada is part of the health portfolio and reports to the Minister of Health, but the contracts that were put in place were put in place.
Who was the Minister of Health that oversaw the development of the ArriveCan app?
The ArriveCan app was jointly developed between the Public Health Agency and the Canadian Border Services Agency.
During the time that the ArriveCan app was first developed, who was the Minister of Health?
At the outset of the pandemic, the Minister of Health was Minister Haidu.
The Auditor General said your agency was responsible for setting the governance structure, which you referenced, which are the rules, procedures, and processes for ArriveCan. This was your duty at PHAC. That's correct?
Yes.
If PHAC is part of the health portfolio and the Minister of Health was Minister Haidu, then as the minister, she's responsible for this major failing. There was no good news in the Auditor General's report for the government, for the Ministry of Health, or for the Public Health Agency of Canada in that report. So do you recognize that this is a major failing, this $60 million boondoggle?
Mr. Chair, we certainly recognize that the failure to put in place formal project governance at the outset of this project led to inadequate oversight of the project and meant that the costs were not appropriately tracked as they were developed. And we have put in place numerous measures to ensure that this does not happen again. It was a large public health emergency.
I would say that not only was there a failure, it's not acceptable that they weren't tracked. The total cost, is not acceptable. Initial estimates at $80,000 and ballooning to $60 million with single source contracts and, 2 guys in a basement being paid, $20 million. These are failures. So the minister failed.
The contracts that were put in place were administered by the department.
So let me just be very clear, Ms. Jeffrey. If this is a failure, who is accountable for departmental failures? Is the minister responsible for what goes on in the department?
As the deputy head of the organization.
Who does
I
the
am
deputy head
responsible.
report to?
The deputy head reports to the clerk of the Privy Council and to the minister, depending on the subject, and the
To the
authority
minister.
that's being delegated.
To the minister. And the authority and responsibilities are delegated from the minister. This is the minister's failure, and that's what's been evidenced in the reporting by the Auditor General.
You're spot on. Thank you, Mr. Barrett.